Hello, English 3, and welcome back to American Literature. Just a reminder, everything you need for this unit will be under the American Literature tab on Google Classroom. And today we are going to be jumping into Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, otherwise known as kind of the beginning of the Pilgrim story with the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock and all of that. Something that I think a lot of us are at least somewhat familiar with, or have at least heard of. I think most of us know of the Pilgrims, and maybe we associate things like Thanksgiving with that story. And I know a few of us, when we were reading Las Casas's account, talked about Thanksgiving, and we talked about how we were wondering if it looks exactly like what we thought it was as we were told as children. And so today I want to kind of dive into that question and to look at what William Bradford has to say about the Pilgrims coming to America. So today our focus is going to be on point of view, bias, and perspectives. And so this story is a narration by William Bradford about his own experiences coming on the Mayflower to start the colony in the Americas. And I want us to look at what is going on in his narration exactly. And so on Google Classroom, there is a post that says point of view, or abbreviated POV, and bias, William Bradford. And on there, I have an attached document that has these questions. So who wrote this story? Who benefits from this story? And whose voice is missing from the story? And so these are the questions that I want to work on answering today as we analyze Bradford's point of view, bias, and perspective in his own narration. As a reminder, whenever we do any of these writing assignments, I want you to use textual evidence. That's something that we learned when we did our Native American creation stories. So you might be tempted to say, who wrote this story? Well, William Bradford wrote this story. That's easy. But go a little bit deeper. What is his narration telling you about who he is as a person? What is some things he might kind of self-proclaim about himself in his story? Who is he referring to himself and his experiences as collectively? So don't just say William Bradford. Tell me who he is and who he says he is, and then use your textual evidence to back up how you are analyzing that information. Same thing, who benefits from the story? Don't just tell me William Bradford. Think broader than that, and think about exactly what his story, his narration is telling us. And same idea from whose voice is missing from the story. Don't just say whose voice is missing in 2 words. Say whose voice is missing, and then give me examples of where their perspective is not being heard, and how maybe you would think of that a little bit differently if you had their perspective or point of view as well. So on Of Plymouth Plantation, this PDF is on that same post. There's some contextual information up here about William Bradford and the situation, as well as even some like vocabulary and whatnot. But we'll be focusing on the actual text. If you want to read that, please feel free to do that. One thing I do want to highlight before we get started is this little piece of a sentence right here. The local Native American tribes had had 100 years of contact and conflict with European settlers before the Pilgrims landed at Cape Cod. So, I want you to keep that context in mind as we're reading, because I think that will make you think about some of these events a little bit differently. And so I'm going to give you just some examples from these first couple of paragraphs of ways that you can pull some information out to answer those 3 questions. So, to begin, but to omit other things that I may be brief, after long beating at sea, they fell with that land which is called Cape Cod, the which being made and certainly known to be it, they were not a little joyful. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and mysteries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. So, To perhaps start answering the question of who wrote this story, we already have two things in these first two small paragraphs. First of all, we could talk about how they are Christians, which perhaps just God of Heaven doesn't immediately say Christian as a religion, but we do know that the Pilgrims were Christians, and so, but this is some textual evidence for us to kind of call back to that of where their religious affiliations lie. And remember, that has been kind of a common occurrence of many of the kind of first settlers that we've talked about so far. We also could quote this here: to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. So for me, that really small little sentence tells me that these people that are arriving in North America are not like seamen. Like, they are not experienced sea people. That is not something that they enjoy or are maybe skilled at. Being at sea is not their comfort zone. And so we know that they're not just, let's say, merchants or people who would travel perhaps for a living of some kind. Or even, for example, like the Vikings, who were kind of known for their ships. These people are a different type of group. Then to continue on, but here I cannot but state and make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. So here's something. William Bradford calls themselves poor people. I think this means less maybe poor in money and more as in poor in spirit or poor in perhaps life circumstances, if you will. But another thing to look for what William Bradford is saying about himself. And also, by saying poor people's present condition, to go ahead and answer who benefits from this story, William Bradford is kind of making himself a bit more sympathetic to the general audience. And so I think the reader, too, when he considers the same. Being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians, when they met with them, as after will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the season it was winter, and they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent, and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men, and what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes, for which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there is a mighty ocean with which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. So this is where we're going to start looking at that last question. Whose voice is missing from this story? Remember what I pointed out in the very beginning. Before the Pilgrims ever even arrived in North America, the Native Americans living there had been experiencing pretty extreme conflict with the settlers who had already came. Remember what we read about with Las Casas. I don't know that everything was that severe, but things like that were happening to some degree. And many of the conflicts that these peoples would have experienced would have been like that. So that's kind of what's going on. So look for those types of things that you can pull out, such as savage barbarians or wild beasts. Those are things that are telling you whose voice is missing and the perspective and point of view that Bradford has. So go ahead and finish filling this out and filling it in. And then the last thing I want you to do after that is to submit something that says free write. Okay, and the last thing I want you all to do is to go onto Google Classroom, and there's a post that says free write perspectives. And on that post, it's just going to ask you a question that is, if you were an Indigenous person experiencing the same things that Bradford was experiencing, so an Indigenous person in his story, what would your perspective be of those events? So read through Of Plymouth Plantation and go ahead and think about everything that's going on. And if you were someone else with that 100 years of conflict and some possibly other bad experiences, what would your perspective of the situation be? And that will be all for Of Plymouth Plantation today. And we will pick up tomorrow with a Puritan sermon, which will be a little bit different. So I hope you all have a good day. If you need any help with any of these assignments, just reach out and let me know.